Hello and welcome back to All You Need Notes for Edexcel IGCSE History. And in this third episode in the series, we'll be looking at the rise of Hitler and the Nazis to January 1933 as part of the Germany 1918 to 45 part of the specification. I'll be looking at two effects of every single topic in it, and so let's begin. So firstly, the changes to the German Workers' Party. One effect of this was that the NSDAP became more popular. So Hitler declared himself Führer of the NSDAP in 1921, and Hitler was an excellent speaker. He attracted many audiences. He made his point very well, and so many people sympathised with him. They agreed with his stance of going against Versailles. He disliked the betrayal that Germany had suffered. They liked his anti-Semitism, his anti-communism. They feared communists after the 1917 Russian Revolution, and they thought that Hitler had the right stance against them. His 25-point programme, which he'd made, which was a mandate of what he'd do if he was in power, that was very popular, and so the membership of the NSDAP rose to over 1,000 by 1920. And they had a newspaper called the People's Observer that could influence opinion. Second effect was that Hitler set up the SA. So the SA, or the stormtroopers, were veterans from the First World War who agreed with Hitler's anti-Versailles stance and his nationalistic ideas. So they disliked the betrayal of Germany, they disliked the 132,000 million mark fine, or reparations bill. And so they joined the Stormtroopers, which was led by someone called Ernst Röhm in 1921, and that gave strength to the Nazi Party. So the SA did a variety of different things. They fought communists, they disrupted the opposition meetings, they played a huge part in the Munich Putsch, as we'll see on the next slides, but many middle-class voters saw them as unruly and a bit thuggish. So, the Munich Putsch. The specification makes it quite clear that not only do you need to know the effects of the Munich Putsch, but you also need to know the causes and the events of it. So we'll run through the causes and events. So there was general anger amongst the German citizens about the November criminals, so the people who had signed the Treaty of Versailles, and the betrayal in the Treaty of Versailles, so the reparations bill, losing parts of Germany to other countries like West Prussia. Also the invasion of the Ruhr, the humiliation with the war guilt clause, and, as I was saying, the invasion of the Ruhr and the subsequent hyperinflation also made Weimar quite unpopular. So after the government had failed to resolve the French occupying the Ruhr, as we saw in the first video, the German government printed a lot of money, and this led to rapid inflation, or hyperinflation. So this was a cause of discontent. Many were plunged into poverty. The government was seen to be doing nothing about it, and so Weimar was very unpopular. So Hitler, he'd seen Mussolini's march on Rome and how he'd taken power, and he thought that the NSDAP were ready. So they had the SA now, they had 20,000 supporters, and they had quite an important supporter called Ludendorff. He had been a war hero in the First World War, so he provided credibility to the party, and they were ready to take action. So on the 8th of November 1923, Hitler and the SA stormed a Bavarian beer hall, and they surrounded the leaders of Bavaria, the leaders of both the Bavarian government and the police in Bavaria, and they made them swear oaths of loyalty. And Ebert, who was the president, he declared a state of emergency, and so the police came and they had a full-on confrontation with the Nazis. They killed 14 Nazis, and eventually they arrested Hitler and also Ludendorff. So the effects of the Munich Putsch then. The first effect was that the popularity of the NSDAP increased. So Hitler's trial was massively publicised in the press, and so Hitler's speeches were published and distributed to many different people, and they attacked the government, and they were seen as quite popular, so people agreed with him. They thought that what he was saying was right. Also, Ludendorff, he added respectability to the party, so he was very, very popular. He was seen as massively important in the First World War, and so more people supported the NSDAP because they thought that Ludendorff was right in doing so, that the NSDAP was a popular party now. And Hitler's nationalistic views, so strong Germany, he made speeches against Versailles, they were very, very popular. And so even though the NSDAP were banned, they ran in 1924 under a different name, and they managed to win 32 seats in that election. Second effect is that Hitler went to prison. So he was found guilty of treason, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison initially, but he only ever served 9 months. And whilst he was there, he wrote Mein Kampf, which was his autobiography, and all about his reflection on Jews, on Germany, on Versailles. So he was laying out his ideas, and it really changed his focus of what he wanted to do if he gained power. He also, and this was a key change, he decided to try and overthrow Weimar democratically. So rather than try another putsch, rather than try by military force to take over the Republic, he decided to change it from the inside to stand in democratic elections, and hence why in 1924 the Nazi Party did stand, although under a different name. Next, the reorganization of the party from 1924 to 28. So one effect of this, as we've briefly covered, Hitler wanted to win democratically. So he decided that the NSDAP should stand in elections for the Reichstag, and under a different name, the party won 32 seats in 1924. Because he was winning democratically, because he was now campaigning, and we'll see a bit more about that in the next effect, the party membership of the NSDAP grew to 100,000 by 1929. Many supported him, he was effective in what he was saying, he became much more popular, and through elections he managed to expand his image. So the trial had allowed him to publicise his views, and the NSDAP became sort of a national political party. However, and you get different points, but Stresemann, as we saw in the second video, he had done a variety of different policies, and it had increased Germany's popularity on the world stage. It had restored trust internationally in the Weimar Republic, and so everything that he did made the milder parties, like the SDP, much more favourable. So that actually, even though party membership continued to grow, they only won 12 seats in 1928. So winning democratically didn't always work, but it reorganised the party, and they were set now on a line of trying to win elections. So the second effect was that the Nazi policies were directed specifically at voters. So as we saw earlier, the 25-point programme had been introduced, and this promoted nationalistic sentiments, so stuff like Germans and Germany to be put first, and nothing like Versailles. They weren't going to be beaten down by their old enemy in the war. Jews and communists were not to be tolerated. Germany would be put first. Goebbels, who was head of propaganda in the party, he emphasised their anti-Semitism, which was a very, very popular message with the voters. Many people traditionally feared Jews. He emphasised this in the propaganda. This obviously made the Nazi Party more popular, and people thought they were a credible political force. Hitler himself, as we said, also was a good speaker. He would speak to many, many audiences every day. He set up a variety of different Nazi organisations which appealed to certain voters. So you've got Hitler Youth, which was set up in the 1920s. This was to engage younger people who hopefully would go on to vote for the Nazis. Nazi Women's League, so this was for mothers, wives and women, to encourage them to vote for the Nazis in elections. So it was all geared towards certain people, and Hitler also set up local Nazi leaders in different states, all of this to encourage people to vote for the Nazi Party. The Great Depression then. So the first effect of the Great Depression was that people lost their jobs. So as we saw in the last episode, the Wall Street crash happened in 1929 and people lost their jobs. So over 50% of young people were unemployed in 1933. Businesses collapsed because the US recalled those $800 million loans, and the German banks recalled the loans that they'd given to businesses in turn. Many didn't have money to spend, they lost their jobs, they had to suffer wage cuts. And because so many people were now unemployed, the fact that the Chancellor, who was then Brüning, he reduced benefits for the unemployed. So this just made life even more difficult. People had very little money, they had no job, plunged into poverty, they couldn't afford anywhere to live, the family was starving. It wasn't a good time. Second effect was that support for extremist parties increased. So Brüning, he increased taxes, so that's always going to be very unpopular, but especially in a time when people are struggling, they now have to pay more. He had to use Article 48 to govern. If you remember, that's where the president makes laws instead of the Reichstag voting for them. And he used this 66 times in 1932. This undermined trust in the Weimar system, because technically he wasn't even passing laws democratically anymore. He didn't have the support of the Reichstag, and he wasn't seen as very popular at all. And so the extremist parties, both on the right, so the NSDAP, the Nazis, and on the left, the KPD, the communists, they massively benefited from this anger at the moderate parties. And the Nazis had 400,000 SA stormtrooper members by 1930. So this is significant because the Nazis had employed 400,000 people, especially young people. These were people off the streets. They'd given homes to them, they'd given a job to them, they were giving money to these members of the stormtroopers. So the Nazis could say, look, we're actually doing something about the depression here, we're helping people to get a job. And also the Nazis became popular with their propaganda, so they claimed that the Jews and the communists had caused this depression on purpose, and this obviously, scapegoating, blaming someone was very, very popular. And we saw that they'd only got 12 seats in 1928. They now got 107 seats 2 years later in 1930, so a huge increase. There was great disappointment with the moderate parties, and Hitler's message was very, very effective. So it really did help him to become a much bigger force in politics. Now, the methods of winning support. So one part of this was that voters were enticed by Hitler and his propaganda. So lots of Nazi propaganda designed by Goebbels. It showed Hitler as anti-communist, anti-Semitic, anti-Versailles, and as we saw, this was very appealing to voters. Hitler spoke at several rallies every single day. He talked to massive crowds of people in cities across Germany. He would entice younger voters with marches and parades around these rallies. He seemed a strong leader. He was very, very good at speaking. He persuaded a lot of different people. He gained massive support. And obviously the anger at the Great Depression, at the subsequent chaos, it didn't just stop in 1929, 1930, it continued. And so in the July 1932 elections, Hitler doubled his previous vote share. He got 230 seats in the Reichstag, so a huge amount, and actually the biggest party then in the Reichstag. And he had 8 newspapers to dish out his propaganda across Germany. Second effect of this was that the SA brought power to the Nazis. You do need to know the role of the SA in how Hitler won support. So there were 400,000 members of the SA by 1930, and they would attend rallies with Hitler. They were attractive to voters. They made Hitler seem strong. They would march with flags. This just showed nationalism generally. It showed Hitler's message of being for the German people. And obviously, as we looked at, they offered jobs to the young, unemployed Germans, making Hitler seem like he was actually doing something about the depression. He was giving jobs, he was giving money, he was giving homes to unemployed Germans as part of the stormtroopers. They also disrupted opposition meetings. They would go at polling stations and they would intimidate voters, so they would sort of leer over you, and so you'd be more inclined to vote the Nazis for fear of what they might do if you didn't. There was a consequence to that, because the middle class voters, it did put them off. You know, they didn't like these thugs coming to polling stations and trying to change voters' minds and intimidate people. So that did have both a positive and a negative effect. But the essay did bring great power to the Nazis. Whilst this methods of winning support section probably wouldn't come up in a B question, learning these effects are really, really good for your C question, where they could well come up. How did the Nazis win power? And then you talk about the role of the essay in this. So they marched with flags, and they were many members, they disrupted opposition meetings. So it is important to learn a whole variety of things in the specification. That's just a little side note. And the next part then, the events of 1932 to January 1933. So this is just a summary of what happened and how Hitler eventually became Chancellor. So in March of 1932, there were the presidential elections. If you remember, these happened every 7 years, according to the Weimar Constitution. Hindenburg had been the president for a while after Ebert had died, and Hitler ran against Hindenburg. He lost, but Hindenburg really disliked Hitler after that. He'd run directly against him. Even though he hadn't come that close, Hitler still had got a significant amount of the vote. I'm talking millions here. And Hindenburg didn't like the fact that he was running against him, and so he did take a dislike to Hitler. Von Papen, he formed a coalition with the NSDAP in June. So in June 1932, the Nazis had gained a ridiculous amount of seats. They were now the biggest party in the Reichstag, and von Papen decided to form a coalition with his party. But this coalition was very, very weak. The Nazis, they were the main party in the Reichstag, and they thought that they should be the main party. Von Papen had been the chancellor in this coalition, and the Nazis thought that they should have their members being one of their members being the chancellor, Hitler, and have more members in the government, and so they were constantly going against what von Papen was trying to do. There was just general chaos, and so von Papen resigned as chancellor. Because Hindenburg really disliked Hitler, he didn't want to make him chancellor, even though businessmen were writing to him and saying, you know, please promote Hitler. He didn't, and so he chose someone else. He chose an old military person called von Schleicher to be chancellor. Von Schleicher, however, it was revealed to the Reichstag that he was talking to Hindenburg about suspending the constitution and setting up a military dictatorship. The Reichstag found out, and they voted against him, lost their support, and so they kicked him out as chancellor. And now Hindenburg had very little choice. There were no other people willing to become a chancellor. So von Papen went to Hindenburg and he tried to persuade him. He said to make von Papen vice-chancellor and Hitler chancellor. And von Papen said that he would be able to influence Hitler. He didn't and he couldn't, but that's what he thought, and that's what he tried to persuade Hindenburg. And so at last Hindenburg reluctantly agreed that Hitler should become chancellor if von Papen was vice-chancellor and could influence him. And so, on the 30th of January 1933, Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. And that is the end of this video as part of the series of All You Need Notes for Edexcel IGCSE History, with the topic Germany 1918 to 45. And that was the rise of Hitler and the Nazis to January 1933. I hope you enjoyed this and found it informative and helpful for your exams, hopefully. And please, if you did, like and subscribe, because I will be making more of these for Germany and even for the Cold War topic, maybe for America, maybe for some notes on how to answer the question papers. So if you enjoyed, please do let me know. Thank you and goodbye.